Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Rethinking Cyber podcast with me, Rebecca McLaughlin-Easton. We're back for a second series of in-depth and insightful conversations with thought leaders and global industry experts as we continue to raise awareness for the challenges and opportunities surrounding cyberspace. My guests join me ahead of this November's Global Cybersecurity Forum in Riyadh, which this year has the theme of charting shared priorities in cyberspace. My VIP in the hot seat today is familiar to all of us because he's been on our screens at CNN, Reuters, and PBS for more than 35 years. He is John Defterios. He is a media veteran, an award-winning journalist and an economic analyst. Plus, he is a strategic senior advisor for APCO Worldwide and an business professor at NYU Abu Dhabi. Hello, John. It's great to see you. How are you?
Yeah, nice to see you in person for this podcast, which is an unusual happenstance, if you will.
It's been a while, but it's great to be back in the same room as you. John, I'm going to start by asking you to tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself. I think it's a great way to set the scene for our conversation. I first saw you on set in a studio in London about 24 years ago. You were presenting, I was producing, and I'm happy to say that we're still bumping into each other all these years later, not least at GCF. But tell me, looking back on your broadcast career to date, what would be some landmark moments for you?
Well, I'm one of those people that actually is living his dream. So I started my personal journey wanting to be a journalist at 7. I was fascinated by the space mission to the moon in 1969. And I thought, look at the power of television to get everybody convening around the world at a single event like that. So that was the spirit in which I got in. And then I interned at CNN in its first 2 years on the air. And then I had a couple of very good mentors. And I went to Washington, which led me into a joint venture between PBS TV, where I was a producer, and ended up in London. So at 27, I was a foreign correspondent and kind of stumbled into a fantastic story, which was the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the fall of communism throughout, the creation of the single market for the European Union. I was fortunate enough to, unfortunately because of the Gulf War, but fortunate as a journalist to cover the invasion of Kuwait and all the implications of it. And that got me introduced, if you will, into the OPEC world. And I've made energy a specialty for the last 30 plus years. So it's been a fantastic journey. We have that belief, I think it's the same in Ireland, for example, that you can do whatever you want in the world if you have the drive and the connectivity and the right education. And I'm one of those, let's put it that way. I've been very fortunate.
Inspiring stuff. We're here to talk about cybersecurity ahead of GCF taking place this November. It's easier sometimes to relate to personal stories, isn't it? Have you been touched in any way by any breaches of any kind?
Well, it's a very personal experience because when I moved my family to the UAE from London, I remember sending a letter to my bank in the United States saying that I am moving and here's my new address. It's a signature letter that signifies I am moving overseas. And within that window of time of 2 weeks when we were moving, my bank account was hit in a very lavish way, and I didn't see any security alerts because we were so busy moving, and my children were 5 and 7 at the time, and there was just a lot on the table, right? Because we were starting a new program for CNN based in Abu Dhabi, and it was a steep work curve at the time, and I just took my eye off the ball for a couple of weeks, and it was substantial. But it was such a great learning experience, Rebecca, because in that 2-week window, my profile was changed. My address was changed to Northern California. It wasn't too alarming to the bank because I'm from California. They fished on a couple of transactions, which I didn't see because I was really distracted in the first 14 days. And they hit the account for a phenomenal amount of money. It was a mortgage account, savings account, which also had mutual funds inside of it. But what was extraordinary is that the initial reaction from the bank is we won't replenish the funds. And the only thing that saved me was having the signed letter, which I was able to produce. But then it took about 4 weeks to get the money back. And I said, well, we know all the retailers that the culprit hit. What do you do next? And they said, we don't do anything. I said, well, why not? And they said, well, at the time, and that was going back 15 years ago now, it's a $35 billion business for the fraudsters in the United States alone. So the banking system said we'd spend all our time chasing fraud and cybersecurity. So to me, I thought, well, why don't we have greater education in this space? It should be something we should be focused on. And I learned the hard way, putting in the safety triggers, looking at the account every 3 or 4 days. What's the latest software I could do to protect ourselves? The banks have moved to apps with a double clearance to get in, as you know. But 15 years ago, that was not the case. And the fact that there's a whole economy around it that we're not focused on. And my view on this, and I think you'd agree, if you think about the top 5 issues of today, clearly one of them is the economy and inflation and having the highest inflation, better than 4 decades. The post-pandemic recovery and the implications of it, but the shock of the pandemic and the strain on healthcare systems was another one. Because of what we see taking place even in my home state of California, they had a hurricane threat, which became a tropical storm, but still something that never happened in 80 years. Fires in different corners of the world, so climate is clearly important. Security risk made us think about the geopolitical relationships around the world. But number 5 has to be cybersecurity because it's so much at stake here. It's now a $2 trillion impact on the global economy. So if you look at the scale of the global economy, say the U.S. economy at $60 trillion, you're looking at $2 trillion globally just going out the door and vanishing in terms of its impact. So there should be much more attention and perspective, analysis, information sharing along the way, I think.
Well, that puts it back on us, doesn't it, arguably, because the media has a responsibility to not only inform and educate and entertain, but we can really shine a spotlight on the issues. So take me behind the scenes in the TV world, behind the scenes in the making of a TV program. How do you set the news agenda for the day?
Oh, that's a great question because it's not as complex as people think, right? So even if I was a business presenter, doing an hour-long program, we also had to kind of be aware and bring in the different strands of an editorial day. So maybe 5 or 6 major stories of the day. And I think herein lies the challenge for cybersecurity because you have now, at say a CNN or the leading digital publications or newspapers around the world and other broadcasters, specialists in technology. And they gravitate towards, the latest iPhone or latest smartphone on the market, or they gravitate to what's happening in artificial intelligence, or they gravitate to, autonomous cars, for example, which is technology interfacing with the consumer on the ground. But to have a specialty in cybersecurity is something entirely different because it's a whole new world that most people are not aware of. So it talks about a much wider story. And if you have a major breach, which we've seen in the last couple of months, they happen daily, frequently every day. But does it have the basics? Does it have pictures?
Well, no, more often than not.
Right? So it's hard to tell that story. There was a breach, for example, in Northern Ireland of police data, and that was super sensitive because a lot of the police that work in detective work can't have their profiles shared, of course, for obvious security reasons. That's out there. And, once the genie's out of the bottle, what are you supposed to do? That story lasted maybe 48 hours in the UK. In the rest of the world, it lasted 24 hours because there was not a lot of material to work with. And again, you have to ask, who are the specialists I can talk to that really understand it and those specialists that can translate it to the average consumer? And that's the wrestling match every single day when you see a breach. Now, I think there's been a profound shift the last 3 or 4 years. You see the story count, if you will, in cybersecurity going up. But the challenge is, even if somebody's a technology correspondent, to say they're a specialist in cybersecurity is an entirely different matter. I would argue you have good national security people on the broadcast platforms that understand national security or military security. Are they specialists that can translate to cybersecurity? No. Can the technology reporter go from covering technology and how it interfaces with society into cybersecurity? I would say no. So we have to think about it differently, about building the ecosystem for robust coverage in the journalism community.
You do see things improving, but can we point to an inherent global media bias when it comes to coverage? It's seen within a very narrow prism.
It's quite extraordinary because in the United States, in California or in Florida, you had cases of threats to the water systems or the power systems, right? And There's an interesting figure that's out there that 61% of the attacks are against the airlines and perhaps the airline system. So we're in a very fascinating window of time where you want to educate the consumer, but not create panic, which then erodes trust. But every time they do a transaction for an airline ticket or they go into their banking app or they want to use, say, Amazon or just anything to get a food delivery, if I have any doubts that my data is going to be breached, I perhaps will not stay online. So this is part of the challenge we have today. So when you hear that 80% plus, I think it's 86% of the business leaders of the world think that we're on the cusp of a catastrophic attack technology-wise to various systems around the world, what are the business leaders seeing that we're not seeing today? For example, the World Government Summit that took place in Dubai, 3 or 4 years ago, they were talking about the threat of a pandemic was real. And I remember hearing that from the different healthcare leaders. And I think, what are they seeing that I'm not seeing? So what I think we should suggest here to the media companies themselves and to consumers that are listening, why is the business community showing this sense of alarm? How about the Global Cybersecurity Forum that takes place in Riyadh, saying we need to lead from behind and have people coalesce as governments and as think tanks and as the business community and take concerted actions together to protect our societies in the future. There should be a coalition of the willing when it comes to cybersecurity and technology, I think. It's the coalition that has the best practices, that doesn't want to own anything. They just want to lead to planned action going forward, I think is the approach.
Do you think there's a speed bump? There's a challenge that stands in the way of that happening? And if so, what would it be?
I think what would be a concern is like, who is going to lead this? Now, you ask a fantastic question because recently Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of the UK, had a conversation with Joe Biden, and he said, we want the UK to be the global center of artificial intelligence. In a G7 world, that would make a lot of sense. But if you fast forward and you've looked at the research that's out there about the E7, the emerging economies of the world that will surpass the G7 by 2040, they're populated, developing economies, and there's players like Saudi Arabia with aspirations to grow to a top 10 economy. You look at an economy that most people don't focus on. Why would they be so willing to say, let's, of course, have this based in the UK? And then you talk to people in technology and they say, well, that would make a lot of sense to be tilted so much to the West when it comes to cybersecurity. Why don't we have a global effort that includes the developed world and the developing world that looks equally west and to the east and to the north and to the south? So what I'm getting at here, we're sitting in the Gulf. It's not out of the box to think that the Global Cybersecurity Forum can coalesce this sort of leadership from behind, bringing the best voices from the East and the West that I was talking about, having a voice for the developing world, the Global South. What I do think is a stumbling block here is that when we had the pandemic, and I was really praying this was not going to be the case, but people cocooned. And then we didn't have that global collaboration for the first 6 to 9 months. And if you look at who did get the vaccinations last, really was the Global South, which I think is tragic. So we can't move into this awareness of global cybersecurity and say it's business as usual. It should be a G7-led effort. The G7 obviously needs to be at the table, but it has to be the G20 countries, which is wider. But I would say go even wider than that and look at the next generation of drivers of growth. And then what do we do about the world's poorest countries that are having potential for growth that even in the COP process often get overlooked, right? Because there's a loss and damage fund of $100 billion. They've been talking about it for more than 10 years, and they haven't funded it yet. So if you take that approach to cybersecurity, we're in deep trouble. So if we're saying, and I think we're in agreement, that it's a top 5 issue of the future, and I think the future is now, then we have to have the Global South as part of the equation. But the key drivers of growth for the future, who have assets, who have now the knowledge, that are willing to lead from behind, should be front and center of this coalition that's being built.
Put your NYU Abu Dhabi professor's hat on for me, John.
Oh.
More in a business capacity, of course, your role in Abu Dhabi, but you speak to students all the time. Are they choosing to specialize in cybersecurity? Have you seen any out there on your travels?
Not in the field of journalism, but it's amazing you brought up that question because I've done 2 courses over the last 2 years looking at the development of the GCC as a regional business hub. And I said, well, what are you looking at in the future? And many say, I want to go into business, or I want to go into banking. But more and more of the students that I was interfacing with, and this was an economic and business course, were saying that, I'm going into programming, which I thought was fascinating. So many are opting to get a computer science degree and coupling it with another degree, so like a double major for undergrad, and then they pick up a specialty. And I was enlightened to see that many were willing to go into technology. They know it's a fast-growing area, so that's encouraging. But let's drill a little bit deeper. Nobody talked about going into cybersecurity, right? So if you think about the major energy companies of the world that are making a transition to go from oil and gas and to include something in the renewable portfolio for the future and future-proofing society, just think about the protection that is needed for the energy system.
Colossal.
Colossal. So we know a lot of the attacks are taking place on the utility companies, east and west and north and south. They're vulnerable. But if you think about the building of a new energy system, which includes renewables, the task at hand to build a new energy system, but the task at hand to protect that energy system, right? We know that the bricks and mortar banks of the future probably, they'll be maybe a tenth of what they have in the economies today. If you're building a more robust banking system, think about the security that's needed. If you look at anything, geosecurity needs a technology component. Commerce has a technology security component. Climate has a technology security component. Every major sector of growth in the future,
Indivisible.
it's indivisible. So I think we have to foster that conversation. I think because I'm putting the education cap on, are our universities prepared for the education of cybersecurity professionals? I would say not yet. It's just not part of the common vernacular in the education system. I always thought it would be education leading industries, and it's the other way around. The industries incubate, they look for talent, and then those in industry that need that talent collaborate with universities and say, we need this expertise, and then they build it. So I think we're at that junction again, a kind of critical turning point to say if we know that the business community, the 86%, are very concerned about catastrophe in their sectors and not knowing where the threat's coming from. If they have that sort of alarm, we know that the damage to the global economy is $2 trillion, that you have probably a multiplier of 4 or 5 that needs to be spent in this sector. Think about it. Then the education systems need to prepare our workforce of the future. And I'd say the time is now for that.
When you're on the ground at GCF this time around, what will be some of the burning questions that you'll be asking to your panelists? What do you really want to get to the bottom of this time?
Can we get to the truth of where these breaches are coming from and why, right? And then the other part of the equation, which I think we need to get to here, is that can we have this coalition that's willing to come together, that brings together governments, and organizations like the GCF to the global conversation. And then we say, who are the best think tanks in the world that are doing the best research? Bring them to the table. Who best represents the governments of the global South? Are they part of the equation? If they're not, they should be there. And then also, I think it's very important, as you're suggesting here, to make a call of action to the educators to say, is this on your priority list? So we've had in this conversation that I think you don't disagree with me on this, that it should be a top 5 priority topic of the world. You think of the challenges of today and so much disruption, you cannot let cybersecurity slide off the top 5. So what do we do as a force to be reckoned with to bring everybody around the table that says, let's have very considered action moving forward that doesn't likes, the cyber threats, doesn't recognize borders, right?
Right.
I sometimes I get accused of saying, "Oh, the glass is half full" on all occasions. Oh, you're so naive to try to get this done. Why not? Right? If you think about it, it should be a priority issue.
We must be optimistic. I'm with you. I think you're an eternal optimist, much like
I
myself.
try to be, yeah.
Without hope, where would we be?
Right?
I very much look forward to seeing you on the ground in Riyadh. What are you most looking forward to?
That was such an eye-opener last year. And I remember I put something out on social media that says, it's high time this, gets the attention that's needed. And then some people that worked in the industry say, we're working hard. We have been working hard for the last 10 years. But I think it needs to move to a new frontier of awareness. That's what I hope we can do at the Global Cybersecurity Forum in terms of our discussions. And I'm very curious to see Saudi Arabia be a leading voice in this effort, this coalition of the willing. You could apply 21 international laws on cybersecurity, but how would you ever enforce them if you don't have a unified effort to make this a top 5 priority issue? That's the way I see it.
Top 5 priority issue. That's your headline, ladies and gentlemen, for everybody listening. And on that perfect note, John, we have to wrap up our discussion, but thank you again for speaking to me today, and I'll see you soon in Saudi.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And so it just remains for me to also thank you, our listeners, for tuning in, and we very much hope that you will download more Rethinking Cyber podcasts from Spotify and Apple. We also look forward to welcoming you on the ground at GCF on the 1st and 2nd of November in Riyadh. Until then, take care and goodbye.